Work it, make it, do it, make sense.
So, hello. My name's Steve. Subject of my talk, Agile is not a process. So I'm conscious of the risk of implicit bias, so I'm hoping to mitigate that with a degree of transparency. It's very much an experienced opinion talk. My reason for being here, my core motivation is really to help share my experiences with the hope of gaining some experiences from you all here. I'm around for the entire DevOps all the way through to the close of play Friday. If you see me about, please come and talk to me. I like to make new friends and really looking forward to hearing from you. So I was going through my slide deck in the hotel room last night and I thought, I'll tell you what, it might be time I took this slide out of the slide deck. It's my first computer, the Atari 800 XL, precursor to the Commodore Amiga. And it's the first computer I programmed on. And I thought, I can't really delete it because all of a sudden I had the realization that I've actually been coding for about 35 years. This is an early 1980s 8-bit computer, which made me feel very old indeed. So after that, I studied at Aston University in Birmingham. I'm a Brummie. I then went through the whole dotcom boom at jungle.com, did a little spot of contracting for a short period of time before I became a Java programmer at Metalogic. A few years ago now, joined Majestic 12 as a development manager, or even though at the start I was managing myself. And in 2016, I became development director. I've now got a team of around 15 programmers, most of whom I've recruited myself. And brings me on to Majestic. So if you haven't heard of Majestic, we're quite a specialist firm. We map the internet, we crawl the same sort of scale as Google, Yandex, Baidu, the big web crawlers. We throw away most of the content, and we just keep the links. And what we've been able to do is generate one of the world's largest link maps, which shows, from an information perspective, how all the websites on the web link together. And we sell that over 100 companies, 10 languages, largely to search engine optimizers, but a number of other firms are now getting on the act. The other motivation for being here and on the program committee is my involvement with WM Jug. I'm the founder. We've got a Twitter handle. The meetup group's the best place to get us on. If you do find yourself in Birmingham or do fancy a trip up to Birmingham to speak, please let myself know. My co-organiser, Mark Thomas, is also buzzing around. I don't know if he's in the room at the moment. He's waving at the back, so feel free to grab either me or Mark if the opportunity to speak appeals to you. So on to the main talk. I'm going to start with an apology, and then I'm going to do a little bit of my Agile journey, highlight some of the cases where Agile seems problematic, and then what I'm going to do is try to break down the manifesto, introduce organisational behaviour, bring together some conclusions, and then hopefully at the time we'll have time for both questions and observations. This is a sharing exercise, not just a lecture. So, the apology. I've always hated negative similes. As a manager, I think they're one of the most dangerous, useless tools available. Yet now I find myself using one. I could have quite easily said, Agile is not an elephant. I could have had a few more slides describing what Agile isn't. The reason that I've gone for this title on this occasion is because I fear that at the moment Agile is going through a phase where it's being slapped on just about everything. Next thing you know, it's going to be added onto our breakfast cereal. So these Agile anti-patterns, I think, do need identifying and breaking if we possibly can do. So as an industry, I'd just like us all to pull together and fight the valiant fight on this one. So, as you've seen, started in IT professionally in the late 90s. My Agile journey really began before the Agile Manifesto was published, working in SMEs. They tend to be little chaotic environments. And really, in order to start, I like to use this slide. I've used it for a few years now. For me, the what sort of represents some kind of opportunity, some sort of feature request. It's the sort of task management thing that's held, managed, owned by the business. And for me in Agile, the how is very much the domain of the developers. The business shouldn't really interfere, within reasonable bounds, of course, as to how the feature gets delivered. That's the responsibility of the development team. And down through the middle, we have this kind of barrier that's broached in an Agile context via communication. So soon after it was released, I managed to get my hand on a copy of Eric Evans' seminal work, Domain-Driven Design. If you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. It's one of my favourite textbooks. And in this, Eric Evans introduces the concept of a ubiquitous language. And that is a sort of vocabulary shared by both the developers of a site, of a system, and also the domain owners of the system, the domain experts. And for me, the evolution that's described in this book of this ubiquitous language over time represents the very nature of the conversations that bridge this agile boundary, facilitating in many ways a shared vision. I was also quite lucky in the early days of my career to get taken around a plant that was going to use some of the software that I was working on. And this was an incredibly humbling experience. But we managed to get taken around a very efficient plant, lots of different departments. And for some reason, out of the blue, I thought, I've got an idea. So in every department I went to, I found somebody and I said, well, so you're really the centre of the organisation. And in every department, the eyes lit up. At last, here is somebody who gets it. Here is somebody who recognises how important we are. And what I suddenly realised is that this whole Father Ted Dougal sketch about the cows, worth a trip onto YouTube if you haven't seen it. Father Dougal is confused because there's some cows outside that appear to him to be the same size as the toy cows in the room. And I realised that this degree of cognitive bias has probably evaded just about every organisation I've ever been in, whereby people in one team will see the entire rest of their working universe from inside their own filter. And I soon became aware that the development teams that I worked in also tended to see these external participants within the development process as being both small and far away. About the same time as I was going through this experience with Eric Evans, there was a pickup in DevOps, obviously not known as such back then, where pre-millennial we had CVS, Subversion had come out, had been replacing it, Continuum, Hudson back then. Build systems were becoming more sophisticated and it was being phased out, replaced by Maven. And later on, after a long period of horrible instability, Git became a prevalent distributed build system. So I'd had a little degree of experience of more formal Agile as a developer, but it hadn't gone well. We'd tried to, in one of the places that I'd worked at, go for a Scrum process, and I found myself in one day in the most bizarre situation of sitting in the circle of standing in the circle for the daily stand-up, realising that nobody really understood the purpose of this ritual, that we were all just there chatting about the three questions rather superficially, almost as if we were waiting for some manner of agile fairy to fly in and bless our process. So when I became a manager, I swore to myself that I'm not going to do this. I'm not just going to have this sort of ad hoc stroll into Agile or Scrum or one of the other systems. So obviously you read up on the Agile Manifesto, and I thought what we need is a plan. So I thought, well, what's always worked really well in the past is when I want to get from one point to the other point, and I don't know how to do it myself, you go out and you get help. So we got a consultant, reasonably talented, and there I was, all naive as a new manager, a little bit too cocky, thinking, I fixed the problems that the other guys couldn't do. Now all I've got to do is take us from A to B with the help of this consultant, and we'll be in the cash. We'll be able to scale our team up from about 5 developers infinitely. What I soon realised is that even with help, change is very, very difficult. Because you start off with a plan, a simple plan, a lovely plan. You're going from A to B, and it's a nice stroll through the nice white background on the board. But it doesn't appear like that, because all of a sudden you have an unforeseen problem. Even with help, they're not experts in your business. And you think, oh, now I've got that, I can carry on. And lo and behold, another problem. And another problem. Leaving you with dead ends, working back. And one of the things I did quite early on is that as soon as we got to a reasonably stable state that I was happy with, I got myself a little book, just a little free book from a conference such as this, and then visualised all my experiences and problems so I could use it to refer back to. And if anyone wants to flick through that, you're welcome to pop up at the end of it. I don't want to go through all of it now, that would be a little bit boring. But a couple of the things that we realised is that whilst it's great to have multifunctional teams, we can't really lose sight of sometimes the internal products that we have sometimes we'll have libraries, frameworks that are produced in-house that require the same degree and respect as customer-facing projects. So just because there's no direct client-customer relationship doesn't necessarily mean that there's not important stakeholders within the development team itself that require respect. The other thing that we realised is that as soon as we started realising that we had internal projects and splitting the team down a little bit, is that we had this sort of misunderstanding of cadence within Scrum. We thought you'd just have every single Scrum team in the same organisation working perfectly in synchronicity. And soon realised that life isn't like that. So what we did is we just embraced it and thought, hey, team A works to one cadence, team B works to the other cadence. We'll plan the project in such a way that we'll try to keep releasing features, shove stuff back up the backlog, and just live with the inevitability that sometimes some people are going to be late, some people are going to be ill, and some projects are just going to be unforeseeably delayed. So we've had a bumpy ride, but a good ride. About 4 years ago, I became confident enough to start talking about all of this, so we think we're doing quite well at the moment. And I started looking outside of the organisation for problems and started trying to figure out why we'd had some of these issues in the first place so that we could avoid replicating them as business scales, and also when I'm going and doing things along these lines, I can share some experience that's a practical help for the audience. One of the things that I think may have triggered some doubt early is this whole concept of a managerless environment that's promoted by the likes of Valve. I don't know if anyone's read the handbook. I believe it works well for them. They're a successful business. They're doing very, very well. They are American. That has slightly different employment regulations, laws to European companies. Personally, I am doubtful if you can get a truly accessible, diverse workforce where you don't have a degree of structure or somebody that will be able to act as a policing function, some kind of strong HR manager role. But I've not seen their operation close up, so I wouldn't want to condemn it. The other anti-pattern that I've seen quite common is that for some reason, and maybe it's because they both begin with A, there's a misconception that all of a sudden, because we're going agile, there's no rules anymore, no need for roles. I heard of one place where one of my colleagues former colleagues was most distressed to find themselves in an environment where their role as tech arc had just been dissolved overnight, allowing relatively junior programmers to make the decisions that they'd been prevented from doing so. Very, very quickly that became a huge mess, but fortunately for the organisation themselves, they'd made a few steps to be able to revert the process, but it was an incredibly costly experience. The other one is this fantastic blog post by Michael O'Church, Why Agile and especially Scrum are Terrible. It acts as a kind of lightning rod for everybody that hates all things Agile and especially Scrum. And at first I was there thinking, no, you guys have got it wrong. And it took a few pages and a few pings of the blog being updated for me to realise that, well, maybe they're not wrong. Maybe these people that are on this website that are recording these comments, hating Agile, hating Scrum, actually have some manner of point. And I started to reflect. About the same time, I started an MBA. And as I went through the MBA, I just started to rub that there's a variety of Agile called Scrum. It doesn't seem appropriate. It annoyed me. So I started thinking about the Agile Manifesto, about Scrum, the relationships between the Agile methodologies, the Agile practices, and the underlying Agile values. And that's led me to think about breaking Agile down. So I mentioned the Agile Manifesto earlier. This is one of the versions that people see. Often I believe it's a breach of the terms because you're meant to go all the way through to the signatories and the notice at the bottom. The main thing for me is that the manifesto, these are, the heavyweights of software development. These are the people that have shaped what most of us do on a daily life. You've got Kent Beck, who invented Scrum, Ken Schrober and Jeff Sutherland, who came up with Scrum, Martin Fowler, who only needs to seem to put his signature near a book for it to sell well, an amazing talent. Dave Thomas. Now, Dave Thomas is an interesting guy. He's often listed as one of the original signatories that's become a critic of Agile. He's done a rather charming conference speak. I think it was Go Amsterdam, 2015, called Agile is Dead, a little bit provocative. But his main argument is that Agile is being misapplied, that it's being used to sell an awful lot of potentially inappropriate services, and that really what we should be thinking of ourselves as doing is working with agility. Also on this list we have Jim Highsmith. He's worked on adaptive software development and talks of things such as guiding and bounds in terms of control mechanisms in an agile environment. We've got Ward Cunningham. Don't know how many people are aware of Ward Cunningham here. Credited with inventing the wiki. But for me, more importantly, he coined the phrase technical debt, possibly one of the most misused phrases in IT today. There is a YouTube video where he explains the initial thoughts behind the phrase technical debt, and I'd encourage you all to go out the way and have a read of it, a watch of it. So, for me, there's these two parts. Three parts, really, if you include the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. There's this top part here. We're uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Do this work into value. And then there's this second part, because all the bottom sentence does is reinforce the top one. And one of the commonly used phrases is that over is one of the most repeated words in the Agile Manifesto. And what that's saying is that the things on the right are still important, still very, very useful. They're just not quite as useful as the items on the left. So there we have two elements to the Agile Manifesto. So really what we've got is some kind of spectrum. Or phrased another way, sort of agile dimensions. The thing is that what we're finding when we went through this is it's awfully tricky to find out where you are. There's not a great deal to express what proportion of processes and tools to individual interactions, just that this is more important. Now, as an older software developer, I can remember when people weren't allowed to fix bugs because it was against the process. That's becoming less and less of a case now. Now, Kent Beck has attempted to expand this by moving the higher importance to the left and instead now introducing team vision and discipline over individuals and interactions, over processes and tools. He's got validated learning over working software, over comprehensive documentation. Interestingly as well, he's moved customer collaboration. Instead replacing it with customer discovery. And some of this reflects how the change of the industry has, that now people aren't just building systems to automate tasks, they're introducing new systems to help people in new ways. They have to go out and discover their markets. There isn't an existing market for which they're trying to fulfill. And the last one is initiating change, rather than waiting to respond to change, to actually initiate change in the first place. I think that is quite helpful. I think for me it adds a little bit more structure to it. But the other part is this agile statement, which is quite a strong, subtle statement in terms of helping others do it, uncovering better ways, and what people have come to value. At the end of the day, this is a group of, like say, the heavyweights of software that have come together at Snowbird in early 2001. And they've shared their experiences of XP, of Scrum, of other agile, lightweight methodologies. And they've pooled these shared experiences, these values. They've validated them, albeit quite quickly in peer review. I believe the original manifesto took about a morning to came up. And then they've had the sufficient confidence in it to share it with the whole of the world as an appropriate way of solving software development problems. So, tying things back to the title of the talk. So we've got processes. That's, from what I understand, a transformation of input into an output. Now, pressing the wrong button. I'm not sure I see any sort of transformational in terms of process orientation in any of this. For a procedure, what you have then is a series of steps to outcome or goal. Now, I must stop doing that. There is no set of steps here. There's some weighted features, a statement. Actually, methodology, now, a system of methods, principles for doing something. I'm going to scream next time. You could argue that, to a degree, when coupled with the Agile principles, that there's a kind of pseudo methodology here. I'd personally always referred to it as kind of an umbrella methodology, but I don't really think it's a strong enough statement. So this brings me back to the MBA, and the course I started, the first one I did was called Organisational Behaviour. And this is a cross-disciplinary area of study, including sort of workplace psychology and a number of other disciplines. And what they're doing is they're focusing on the behaviours of individuals and groups within an organisational setting. And in this field, there's a concept called organisational culture. Many, many books written about it. But my favourite definition is by Edgar Schein, who says that the culture of the group can now be defined as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solves its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members is the correct way to perceive, think and feel in relation to these problems. So going back to the summary of this Agile statement, there's a number of similarities between the shared experiences that they're sharing, that they've validated amongst themselves, that they believe is the right way to go about writing software. And this definition of organisational culture by Schein. I should say at this point that this is a slightly controversial comment. I think Uncle Bob doesn't like the separation of practice from culture. But I think there's still a useful base here, that there's a concept that if you have a culture that is incompatible with the change that you're placing upon it, it will actually reject it. So that therefore what I'd argue is that you need to recognise what the current organisational culture is in order to achieve any hope to make a successful change from an existing, perhaps waterfall organisation into one that will accept an agile methodology. Edgar Schein is not the only expert. There are many in organisational culture and organisational behaviour. One of the thought leaders is Gert Hofstede, who started off studying cultural differences, international cultural differences. So, for example, Hofstede's work could tell you that the UK has a higher focus of individualism, but increased short-termism when compared to Germany, for example. So a little bit stereotypical, but still quite helpful when you're dealing with multicultural situations to have an understanding and appreciation of the different implicit biases, the different perspectives that different nations can have. Gert Hofstede went on from that work to interview, I think, hundreds of businesses, 200 businesses primarily around the Netherlands. And he came up with a set of cultural dimensions, well-formed, reasoned, justified cultural dimensions. This is all available on the web as well as through his works. If you search for Gert Hofstede cultural dimensions, there's a number of tools to know how to examine this. And what we've got is a sort of clearer spectrum between means-orientated companies and goal-orientated companies. So a means-orientated company is very much a matter of being told that you are to follow these several steps in order to achieve your goal. This is what I want you to do. A goal-orientated company is you achieve that goal however you want, but this is what we're setting out to achieve. Internally driven is a very inward-looking company culture where people are trying to follow the process that they've got within their organisation. Externally driven is one where they're really open and focusing, trying to serve what the customers think they need. Easygoing work discipline, hard to get fired, mistakes are celebrated. Strict work discipline, if you make a boo-boo, you're out the door. Again, open cultures are, I'll have to get onto that one in a second, employee-orientated and work-orientated are two other ones, and what we've got time for is for me to now hopefully switch to Gert Hofstadter's site. Fortunately, where we can explore it, if the demo gods will be kind. Oh, so as I said, this site has a number of different tools into which we can now examine each one. So we can then have a look through, there's tutorials, clarifications, and we can actually see that for each of these dimensions, there's not just these two extremes, but a whole set of reasons that justify many works of expectations all the way through to D, which is the sort of features we start to think of in an agile environment. Entrepreneurial, working smart, creative, productive, trustworthy. New challenges. So I said about the open system. So this is all about welcoming new people, all about transparency of communication, whereby in a very open system, everybody can work through the door and be valued and contribute on day one. In a closed system, outsiders not welcome. So I'd encourage you all to play with that. No. There we go. So I went through this and I tried to sum up my experiences of a kind of agile workplace. The reason being not just to create something that's transferable in terms of trying to define agile in a cultural sense, but when you have an agile team and you're buffering up against other parts of the business, such as marketing, and they have their own, I believe there's now an Agile Manifesto for marketing, that it's important that there's a degree of this ubiquitous language we talked about earlier, this sort of shared expectation as to what sort of terms mean and what's the overloading of it. And what we find is that, or I found is that, applying these Gert Hofstadter's cultural dimensions to my experiences working agile, we're highly goal-orientated, fairly externally driven. So it's a little bit surprising, you might think, that these aren't all 100% totally externally driven. The reason is that if you're totally externally driven, you'll quite happily sacrifice your clients' long-term needs for their short-term requests. Whereas I feel that Agile is all about facilitating a two-way communication, a process of helping people and guiding people from both sides of the experience. And again, easy-going work discipline. Agile isn't about anarchy, it is about having these lightweight methodologies such as XP that do have rules about them, they do have structures, they're just trying not to get in the way of software development. So it's not just a matter of adopting one extreme, we're saying that there are elements of easygoing work discipline, also elements of strict rules. I think computing now has got to the level where, whilst not potentially professionally officially recognised in terms of doctors and lawyers and such like, we do have a professional outlook. Everyone here has come to a conference learning the best way of doing things, and also in terms of employee orientated, we're not employee orientated as agile to the point of view where people who can't code or keep making mistakes will be tolerated forever. This is all about a discipline, it's about making money. So again, there's a compromise, and these two last ones are semi-autonomous, which means that they depend on the other factors to a large degree. So I said I'd leave some time for questions and opinions. To conclude, at the core of it, and this is not to dispel the practice elements of Agile methodologies. I think that from a company-wide perspective, it's helpful to think of Agile as a culture, not just a methodology or process. And being a culture means that we don't do Agile. I wouldn't say that Scrum is a type of Agile. I would say that we are Agile. There's a quote, often misappropriated, I believe, to Peter Drucker, called "Culture eats process for breakfast." So in many ways we could think that, in fact, maybe Agile does deserve its badge on the breakfast cereal as it eats it for breakfast. And the other thing is that all of these organisational cultures here, the subtlety of how they're observed, is that these are living cultures within real organisations. So how can you take a living culture and sort of freeze it and take it out of the organisation and say, hey, just implement it? I don't think you can. Instead, I think it's helpful to think of is the Agile Manifesto. The cultural aspect of the Agile Manifesto is a template, something that we can strive to implement within our own organisations, but not necessarily something that's going to be stamped on. So really, let's not try to strive to be Agile masters, but simply understand the limitations and the applicability of this cultural template to our own organisations. I'll leave the last words of this talk to Jim Highsmith on the original signatories. In the history section of the Agile Manifesto, so in the final analysis, the meteoric rise of interest in and sometimes tremendous criticism of Agile methodologies is about the mushy stuff of values and culture. And with that, I thank you. There will be some Agile resources up there by Monday, I promise. And with that, any questions or observations?
One may be tricky, but why you would suggest a company not to use Agile at all?
Why would I advise a company not to use Agile at all? So, my background is obviously SME, software development. So from a software development perspective, or just a wider context, and in a wider context, I've worked in Iceland, for example, the frozen food people, not the company. And when I was stacking the shelves and going in the big freezer at -20, I'm just thinking that maybe, that is one sort of area where this sort of sense of empowerment and goal-driven responsibility may not be that useful. In terms of a software development context, I'm getting outside the sort of skill area. For me, most web shops now do seem to be tending towards the Agile methodologies, XP, Scrum, and whatnot. So maybe somebody else has got a better perspective on that than me. I think if you're doing a Eurofighter or something along those lines, where there is an awful lot of upfront design, an awful set of fixed criteria, I certainly wouldn't be wanting to change any of the processes, cultures, methodologies, or anything along those lines that they've already got. Anything else? Or we're going to break early and get to the pub. So I think it's pub o'clock. Thank you for your time.